Our next speaker is Cam Ansell. Most people in the room will know Cam. He's been a thought leader in the sector for about 16 years now, and he's on speed dial for most organisations who are seeking strategic support, because Cam does think well ahead. And I've asked him if he can look at retirement villages versus residential aged care, which is going to be the winner from a strategic point of view. And Cam, if you could come and join us, please.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. I had the opportunity to address this group last year. When I did so, it was with a high degree of optimism, but also it was with an element of uncertainty as well. You will recall that at that point we were still waiting for the drafting of the legislation. We had the task force, which at that point response was being delayed on. But we were able to talk through some of the key influences that was going to shape aged care and retirement living moving forward in Australia. And it's been brilliant this morning. We've talked about quite a lot of the problems, and the beauty of my role now is this next 25 minutes is really all about optimism. When I look at that problem or that opportunity of too much demand and not enough supply, from an operator or a provider perspective, I see that as extremely exciting. And I'm not going to try and solve the problems of the world today, but I am going to talk about how what we do know starts to help us shape the course for the future and the services that people are most likely to want in the future as well. That was a great discussion just then as well. You have a position on whether or not we're sort of fighting government or trying to facilitate and have a little bit more freedom. I'm going to work through to a crescendo at the end of this presentation that's going to give a projection of exactly how much different services are going to be existing in Australia during the expansion that we've been talking about today. And I'm going to try and build up an argument for why that is. And a lot of you will think quite differently than we do. Having worked on this with a number of organisations lately, there are different views. But when we come to the end of it, it'll start to give us a bit of a picture slightly differently to where we've seen in the past. Over the last 12 months, still a lot of uncertainty. We've talked about liquidity requirements and other things that have popped up. We're always going to have this. Thank you, Chris. It's actually been 30 years that I've been in the sector. In that 30 years, the amount of times that something like this crops up is always going to be there. But certainty in terms of the final drafting of the legislation is in place now. And so we are able to look a little bit more closely at what the road looks like ahead for us. The first element is around consumers. And we've spoken a lot today about the number of people coming through the system that are over 80. And I think we get something like 82,000 of them the year after next, and then it's steadily 60,000 for the next 20 years. Yes, it's a lot. It's a huge volume. What we're trying to get across and trying to present around that future is not the number of people, but the characteristics of the people that are embodied in that huge number. This graph here is a little bit of a variation of something that you've seen before, but that red there is the builder generation starting to disappear. And you can see that huge influence of the baby boomer generation that comes up behind it. When our guys in the Melbourne office did this, the research team did this, and suddenly we'd sort of entered this little green bit at the bottom there, and that's Generation X. That's my generation, which I think is a little bit daunting. I became eligible to come into most retirement villages last week. And so that little bit of reality is actually really quite nice, because some of the quantum leaps I'm going to try and make you take in a second is made easier because every time I come here and present to you guys, my guesses about what the older generation become less about guesses and more about reality as I get closer to that point. My denial remains intact. We've talked a little bit about workforce. The other really exciting thing that has taken place in the last year, and it's a little bit subtle, is the realisation from the government that some of the silly stuff that we've done in the past, staffing targets for minutes in residential aged care, don't quite align with reality. And I know we've seen this statistic. Actually, do you know in Australia, we have proportionately more nurses per older people than almost any other OECD country. One of Chris's graphs brought that out beautifully today about our investment in health and aged care. So I know it sounds difficult, but actually, with the exception of the Nordic countries, Australia has the highest proportion of nurses available. So we actually do start from a relatively good place. But no matter what we do, you can see that green line coming down there. That ratio of clinicians to older Australians naturally comes down, no matter what we do. If we ignore the fact that about 26% of nurses in residential aged care are past retirement age, then no matter what we do, how many nurses we take from developing countries who arguably need them more than us, we're going to be going backwards in this. So we need to be thinking and working smarter, making sure that nurses are only doing what only nurses can do, and making sure that we're thinking about the realities of how much services can be delivered at home when the number of older people outweigh the number of people that can deliver services for them. And to a large degree, we have a responsibility to do that. Last year, I spoke a little bit about Costello's intergenerational report and this massive transition that takes place because of all of the babies that we had, particularly after the soldiers returned from World War II. This huge number of older people in the system. And I just want you to think for a second, by the time the builders have handed over their inheritance to their baby boomer and Generation X kids, most of this country's wealth will be controlled by people who have retired. Just think about that. In terms of the possibilities and the potential and the productivity implications that has, it's a bit scary, but it's also very exciting. And one of the most important things that has transpired, and it took place really, really subtly, is the task force did a really good job of identifying ways that we could perhaps rebalance the scales. We knew that at 94% of direct care costs were being funded by the taxpayer. We knew we were going to have a halving of the number of taxpayers available to look after us in our ageing. And the task force did a really good job of identifying those areas where perhaps it just makes sense that we would pay for this stuff ourselves. And in the negotiation that took place, something surprising happened. Section 279 of what will be the final act in Chapter 4 came through, and somewhere between the process of getting bipartisan support, we ended up with a situation where, not recommended by anyone, there is now a split in direct care costs on residential aged care between clinical and non-clinical care. Now, it might not make a huge difference at the beginning, but this is perhaps the vehicle through which we get a rebalancing of how much we ask our kids to pay for us as we move forward. And we move to a situation where we will be paying for more ourselves and the next consumers will be paying much more for their services themselves. Residential aged care becomes much more expensive. Home care services, more clinically focused, will be more expensive. We'll be paying for more of this stuff by ourselves. This is a really positive thing because part of the supply constraints we've had is because we were asking a shrinking taxpayer base to pay more than they possibly could. The supply constraints that we've spoken about today are really interesting, and we know that graph that you've got there on the left is showing investment in residential aged care. More than 80,000 people on the home care wait list, less people are building nursing homes, and have been since the funding cuts in 2016. And so our ability to meet some of the forecasts that we've been talking about today, I don't think it can happen. I don't think it physically can happen, even if a whole bunch of operators were super excited about the new Aged Care Act, retentions and increase in RADs and DAPs. I don't think so. And so supply constraints, I think, are inevitable. Chris had a really cool graph among several graphs that he had today. And one of them was about long-term care, which is how the OECD calculates residential aged care across the country, people's use of nursing homes. And if you had a look at it, it was only up there for a second, but Australia is this crazy outlier where the highest proportion of people in Australia end up in residential aged care, and they stay the longest period of time, median around about 21 months. In most countries, Tom mentioned New Zealand, in the high end of high care in New Zealand, it's under 12 months. And so those supply constraints are real, but we actually have some capacity to be able to work at providing people outside of those more institutional settings. Okay, so that's the road, and that's the way that the road that we're about to be travelling on starts to level out for us. One of the concepts that I've introduced last year was around the concept of it all being home care services. The reason I love this is because it stops us thinking about built form. We've licensed nursing homes up until consumer-directed care came in. We licensed providers to provide home care services. Now, essentially, the entitlement, the right to get a subsidy moves with the consumer, whether they go into residential aged care, whether they're in a village, whether they're in the home in the suburbs. That right comes with the consumer. And because what we've just seen is those consumers are going to have to fork out much more themselves. And nothing drives consumer-directed care more than asking people to pay for stuff. We basically have older people going through the system with a combination of an entitlement to subsidies, if they have an entitlement, and a need to be able to invest in their own care services unless they are poor. And so it's all home care services. It just takes place in different locations. When we think about that then, we turn our thoughts away from the road and towards the consumers. So when we're talking about the sorts of services that people might want in the future and the sort of services that we might want to deliver in the future, think about the things that influence their decisions. It's not a simple metric, but there are a couple of critical ones. The most obvious one is around the acuity levels. This is their functional dependence, their requirement for clinical support, cognitive impairment. What are the needs? How are they reflected in what people are going to want in the future? We know using health cohort data and ABS demographic analysis, we can work out the likelihood of people requiring support, and we can consider and measure for an increase in prevalence for things like dementia as people are growing older. So we can already get a bit of a sense of what it is that people are going to need. Personal wealth, again, we have the data available for us to be able to dissect what that graph was showing us before of a cohort of people who have a huge amount of wealth at their disposal, but not all of them. Also, a large number of people that won't have it. The next component and metric that becomes important is subsidy availability. We now have roughly the rule book to understand what it is that people are likely to get in forms of subsidies. We need to make some suggestions or guesses about how the government might change the dependency, how the dependency ratio might change the extent to which people will have to pay for themselves for direct care costs. But we're starting to fill in the jigsaw about the things that last year remained a little bit uncertain. And then the last component, I guess, is then on people's preference and their flexibility of choice. We need to make slight quantum leaps when we think about how people will exercise that choice. But the fundamental, I think most of us will agree with, is generally people will spend as much as possible to avoid institutional support. So if given the choice and given the availability of subsidies, their personal choice is usually manifests in a decision that gets them to an environment that's as close to where they've been all of their lives and away from anything that's more institutional or hospital-like. And so when we think about all of those different elements, we can start to chart what sorts of services this next generation of consumers might want, might need, and might be able to get supported in. And I just want to break them down for you quickly, and I'll do it in levels of acuity so we cover off on retirement living. And the first one is around those retirement villages that provide accommodation options only. And this is most retirement villages in Australia. So retirement villages in Australia have worked very well with a generation of consumers, particularly the builder generation of consumers, still primary customers, with the oldest of the baby boomers coming through. And they've worked really well to be able to encourage people to come in an environment. They can downsize, they can release equity in the house, Daniel was talking about earlier, and they can be in an environment where they can be of people of a similar genre, similar interest and similar age as them. And that's worked very well. And one of the elements that I think becomes more difficult from that is because this is a generation of people who have been somewhat frugal and grateful to receive the support that's been provided to them and the accommodation that's been provided to them. And they give way to the baby boomer generation, which are the architects of consumer choice, and they are not grateful. And neither are we later, the Generation X either. As the architects of consumer choice, they want to exercise their ability to be able to live in environments which is as much as they have grown up in the future. And they're less likely to be drawn to be going into villages of older people. Indeed, we're busily pretending that we're not getting old at all. We are in complete denial. And that's only going to be accentuated the more people go through the system. And so the likelihood of me wanting to go into as a pull factor to hang out with a whole bunch of old people when I'm pretending not to be old myself is less. And so it's more likely to give way to push factors. And those push factors are health. And I know that this offends some people within the retirement living sector, but I think that there is still growth within the retirement living sector, but I do not think that those that provide only accommodation options are going to go in line with the growth in the number of older people coming through the system. In fact, from about 2033, our modelling indicates that it's more likely that the numbers are likely to decrease, and the ability to be able to get DMF entry contributions for people is going to lessen, and therefore the likelihood that people going into this option will do so because of a lack of choice and a lack of wealth. The next element on the graduating acuity scale is support at home. And Emma and Bev are going to talk to us about some inspiring opportunities for us to think better and be smarter at delivering home care services at home. We're going to get better at monitoring. We're going to be able to have virtual consults. There's going to be a whole bunch of things where technology is going to get us further. But I don't think at this stage that we're going to be able to replace humans with robots, and our ability, at least in the medium term, to be able to support people in their home gets harder the more older people are at home with needs, and the less younger people there are of working age that are able to deliver and support people in receiving those needs. It's more likely over time that older people will need to move or be accessible in their more frail positions to an area and an environment that's built to accommodate that frailty. The other area I think that's going to be really restrictive of home care services is, we've seen before in the slides, we have been very good at restricting access to subsidised care. It's a way of balancing the budget. It's 82,000 people waiting for home care packages at the moment. It was at one stage, Ian would correct me, but it was around about 140,000 people at one stage waiting for home care services. And it is a reality that for the extent to which the taxpayer has to fund it, we need to be able to fund it. And so our ability to be able to support people at home will get better, will get smarter. Again, I don't think it grows in line with the ageing population. The next component is around assisted living, and we've started to talk about this today. So assisted living is an environment where, if you are unable to receive those services at home, either because of affordability or because of frailty or acuity, then purpose-built or villages are able to provide those services for a little bit longer. We spoke, and Chris asked Grant this morning about that risk that we have, that potentially the feds will want to be more regulating of retirement villages. Grant answered that very well by saying retirement villages are our home in the very same way. They are not funding it. And so you're generally able to move outside of the normal residential aged care provisions, including much of the liquidity, but often falling still within home care requirements under support at home eventually. So these sorts of supports can tend to be somewhat costly, but they will often attract home care subsidies to make it a little bit more so. And assisted living takes place often in continuing care villages. One of the statistics that Daniel raised today, I can't remember the exact number, but I think 60% or more retirement villages are being co-located with residential aged care. The work that we do internationally indicate that you don't need to have residential aged care on your site to be able to provide that continuum. In fact, for most developed countries, they don't. And so co-location of residential aged care can be great, but it's not absolutely essential. In fact, in some areas in New Zealand, a lot of the redevelopment work that we're doing at the moment actually is collapsing the size of the residential aged care services, because on average, when you have a village of 200 units, if you've got a residential aged care service that's been built to scale of 100 beds or more, the majority of the people in their residential aged care facility did not come from that village. And if you're using residential aged care as a loss leader, then it's not leading into into the area that should be profitable. And so rethinking our models is absolutely critical, but continuum of care villages becomes absolutely critical moving forward. And the next component is homes that are specifically built for people who are wanting to be out of the residential aged care system and either can't get or don't want to get services within retirement villages. And these are purpose-built care homes. In the US, most of the assisted living facilities are built to get out of the residential aged care mandates. The US is one of the only other countries silly enough to have fixed staffing ratios or mandated minutes. And so getting out of that area is where care homes become more and more important. We're going to have some really exciting speakers today that are somewhere between this and private residential aged care. The next component there is then residential aged care, and we've been talking a lot about the projections about how many residential aged care beds we're going to get to and how important it is that we get there, and the incentives that we need to get there. And again, I disagree. I do not think that we need to get there. I don't think that there is a requirement for us to build the number of residential aged care beds that's been projected by the Commonwealth. I think increasingly residential aged care services, as it becomes more expensive, creates opportunities for substitutes. There is no doubt we will always need residential aged care, and in our modelling in a second you'll see that our expectation for that will grow, but certainly not in line with the growth in the number of older people in this country. For supply reasons it's physically impossible, but I don't think it's necessarily desirable for us either. I think there'll be two elements of how residential aged care work. I think we're going to have those standalone residential aged care homes that have scale on their own and also have scale within portfolios. That's going to be a really competitive area because the very large groups that we see today, the Opals, the Estias, the Regises that have dozens, Opal has more than 100 now, in the future they will have hundreds of homes. They'll be extremely competitive. Their potential and their optimism for the future is getting really, really smart and effective on how they are able to balance those medical models and make them work as well as possible. But I think our average length of stay is going to drop from the 21-month median we've got at the moment to 12 months and less. And being very tight and strong on those models becomes absolutely incredibly important. And the other one is those that are able to provide services in villages, and those will have close relationships with hospitals, but also within the villages themselves. Private residential aged care, I'm getting the bell, guys, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly on this. Private residential aged care are boutique, small household models. Tamar spoke last year beautifully on group home solutions for people with cognitive impairment. They are very effective also for people with high functional dependence levels. And in the future, we think that which will not be subject to residential aged care requirements because it won't be funded under ANAC, will have, for those people with high levels of wealth that are able to buy their way out of institutional support when their care needs are really high. So we're kind of spoiled for choice. So I don't see the problem of trying to solve the world in terms of where we go. I think actually some of the problems are in our heads because I think we're thinking about the past as a reflection of the future. I don't think so. I disagree. I think not just because of the different pressures of the road that is going to impact on us. I think it's the people that are driving. They're going to be asking to pay for more. They're going to have more opportunities to be able to move in the direction that they want to. We need to be responding to them and not the legislation. And this is what we think it looks like. This maps out using all of those different metrics where we think the volume of demand will be moving forward. And I think because we no longer will have to rely so heavily on government or government funding, that our ability to respond to that demand is going to be much, much better. Across the top line, you have residential aged care. As I said, it does increase, but it doesn't get to 400,000 in 10 years. It increases relatively marginally. Most of the nursing homes I walk into every year in this country are not fit for people with high levels of functional dependence. Most of our investment in residential aged care won't be in new ones. It'll be on rebuilding the ones that we've got and making them better for people at high acuity. The one below that one is private aged care. Those people that will fund their way out of residential aged care services when otherwise they really would have needed it. The one below that then, that massive area of growth in green there, is assisted living, being made up of care homes specifically made for older people and retirement villages that deliver homes. And you can see at the bottom there, independent living, those villages that do nothing, that provide accommodation solutions, decrease in size and increase in the volume of people that are in there because they have limited choice, meaning they will move from larger entry contributions into rental models. So that is a little bit of a summary, and it is probably accentuates the excitement and the dauntingness of it when you consider that in just a decade, that projection indicates that the biggest area of growth and the biggest area of service delivery is really operating on the fringes at the moment. And some of the stuff that you're going to hear about today, groups from like Odyssey and LDK are going to be talking, they have been innovating and leading the charge. They'll become mainstream in the future. And for us to be able to think about where we want to be in the future is most exciting. The last 10 years, the last year since this session in March last year, I've done more strategy work with organisations, including a number of you here today, than I'd done in the 30 years before that. We've been really constrained, as Tom said earlier, in our ability to be able to innovate, and we continue to be while we're hamstrung by all of the requirements, and we're addicted to government funding to be able to deliver services. But as that starts to change and we're paying more for stuff ourselves, I think that naturally gives way. Our biggest challenge is not trying to get across all of the compliance. It's trying to let go of it. It's trying to think what our consumers in the future would want in that future and how we can deliver against it. The most successful operators that we're working with, those that are building their plans, are looking at this model, and some of them will see it differently. You guys will see it differently. They'll decide whether they want to be in it, and some of them, you'll have seen that we're helping some of them get out of aspects that they don't want to be in. But they'll take themselves 5 or 10 years out, they'll make a decision about where it is that they want to be in that trajectory and what services that they want to go into, and they will choose a lane that represents their ambition and their strength moving forward. Thank you.